Hello, everyone. My name is Glenn Silloway. I am the Social Policy Director for the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County. And I want to welcome you today to what we think is going to be a great webinar on why affordable housing should matter to everyone. Today, we're going to have a wonderful moderator and panel to go through various aspects of this. But first, before we start that, I wanted to just lay some ground rules. We do want to hear your questions, but we don't have the chat enabled. Today, if you have a question, submit it on the Q&A function, and Janice Langley and I will be looking at those questions and trying to make sure that they all get answered. If we have to time out at the end and there isn't time, I apologize in advance if we can't get to everything, but please submit your questions there. We are recording this, and it will be available at our website in a few days. It takes us a day or two to edit and to make sure that it's ready to go, and then upload to our YouTube channel, linked from our website. We'll be glad to have you see it again and again, and tell your friends. There is a series of webinars. This is the first of 4 that the League is doing on affordable housing. It doesn't come as a surprise to anyone to know that affordable housing is a huge crisis in this county and in counties across coastal California and in a lot of places in the country. Housing prices in New York City are just as crazy as they are here, for example. That has created incredible disruption in our social structure. So over these 4 webinars, what we want to talk about is why affordable housing matters, and go through the process we use to get it now, and then talk about things we might be able to do to improve that and actually start building some housing. That's what we need to do at some point. The state of California has taken a very aggressive role toward housing and housing policy in recent years, and one of our webinars will be talking about that. The next webinar, however, June 5th, noon, it's a Monday, will be about the current policy development policy practice for getting affordable housing, how it's allocated to counties and to cities, and what we can do to promote it within the public policy process. You'll learn what affordable housing actually means at that point, and that's not clear to everyone. We're going to also have an expert on the housing market come and give the other side of the story, the market versus the public policy, June 5th, noon. And we look forward to seeing you there. So now I would like to turn this over to our moderator, Jeff Eccles, who will introduce the speakers and start.
Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate that introduction and setting the table for us. Well, welcome to everyone in the audience. It's a pleasure to have you here this afternoon. And we've got 3 wonderful panelists that are going to share different perspectives on the housing crisis. We simply don't have enough housing, and really focus in on why that matters to you. So I'm going to introduce the 3 folks and let them tell you a little bit about who they are, what they do. And I'm going to ask the question to each of our panelists, why are you passionate about this subject? So we'll start off with Michael for your introduction. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you for having me. Appreciate being here today. Just wanted to give a very brief background of me. I grew up in San Luis Obispo County. I've lived here my whole life. I've worked as a branch manager at a local credit union for the last 10 years. And really in that role, I started to see a drastic imbalance of, who could afford to live here and, how much people were paying. And I started to notice the pain points from both the staffing and how I could retain staff, as well as, just how many people were stretched beyond their means based on housing. So, that really pushed me to go back to school, and I went to Cal Poly for my master's in public policy and focused on housing policy in that. And now I'm working at REACH, and again, happy to push this issue forward as much as possible.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. We're also pleased to have Brenda Mack with us. Brenda actually has lived experience being unhoused and then re-entering the housing market. So we're very interested to hear her stories about her experience. But Brenda, if you would please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you are passionate about this topic.
Hi, I have lived here since 2000, and I am also on the Homeless Oversight council, homeless services, and it is a big thing. I have been homeless, and once you try to get back into housing, you find out it's hard. I've been homeless with my kids. I am very passionate about this because everyone is saying, well, the homeless need to get a place, the homeless need this, homeless need that. There's not enough housing. So what are we going to do? People want their places, but there's no housing. Me, myself, I have a housing voucher. I could not probably afford to live without my housing voucher, which is something that HUD gives that pays part of your rent. And that is my only ability to be able to afford a place. Else I probably might be homeless out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Appreciate it. And the third person on our panelist is Krista Jeffries. Krista has been active on the scene the last several years as a lead at YIMBY. So Krista, if you would please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about who you are and especially why you're passionate about this topic.
Hi, Jeff. Good to see you. Thanks for having me on. Really pleased to be able to be here with these other great people. So I got involved in advocating for housing. I live in Grover Beach, and I'm not from the area. I grew up on the East Coast, but I've lived all over the world. And I have seen a lot of different ways that other people live. And when I moved to Grover Beach, a couple of years after we moved here, there was an affordable housing proposal just a couple blocks over from me. And for the previous year prior to that, I'd been advocating for public art. And the same night that I showed up to City Council in Grover Beach asking for public art to be made a line item in the budget was the same night that people dive bombed public comment opposing this affordable housing project, literally in my backyard. And over the course of a couple of years, including living across the street from a homeless woman who was my age and who had 2 kids my age, getting to know her. She had been homeless for 7 years before she moved in across the street. I started imbibing all of this information from different sources, and it seems like the whole housing situation, which had touched my life in its own way, it wasn't inevitable, and we could fix it. And there are people out there who are advocating for this kind of change. And it was so empowering and encouraging to learn how to show up to public comment, to show up to planning commission, and kind of galvanize people to say, we don't have to sit here and take this. This is not something that we just have to live with. And we actually can make a better future for our kids and for ourselves as well. And the reason I'm passionate about it is the longer I look at housing the more I realize that housing is the everything crisis. If you've got a bee in your bonnet about public finance or public health or safe routes to school or transportation, whatever other issue that you care about that kind of keeps you awake at night, housing is always inextricably linked to that. And it just kind of never really gets old. So I'm always willing to go deeper and learn more and show other people how to show up as well.
Thank you, Krista. Appreciate it. And we appreciate all 3 of our panelists being here today. So let us go into our presentations and dive deeper into why you should care about affordable housing. So Michael, we're going to start off with you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I'm going to share. All right. So really just to give a brief background, this is certainly not a comprehensive dive into it, but by most estimates, California has failed to build enough housing for its population for decades. So it means that in many areas, we aren't keeping up with birth to death rates. And in most areas, we aren't keeping up with immigration versus out-migration. Not going to talk a ton about all of these points, but again, going to go through the high level and make sure that, setting up the rest of these panelists for a good conversation. So looking at, why this is important. It's important because we've continued to grow jobs faster than we've built housing for the increase in workers. And now we're beginning to see an exodus, and the ones that are leaving are the most crucial for a healthy economy. That's the 30 or 25 to 35-year-old working families. And really some people will say, that's how it's always been. People come and go. Maybe our town could be better off just a little bit smaller. Well, here's where it gets to the why you should care. So I'm going to give the economic rationale, and my fellow speakers will expand on the social and moral reasons. But strictly from an economic standpoint, we can't continue growing our economy without a change in the trajectory of this balance or this imbalance right now. So a little bit deeper than that, we've passed the point where businesses are struggling to both attract and retain workers in literally every sector, from education to medical. This looks like 6 to 8 month recruitment timeline for public safety positions. It looks like overcrowding in classroom because there's a lack of teachers. It looks like longer lines literally everywhere. And 6 months to a year to reschedule doctor's appointments, and definitely much more challenging if you have a specialist, a need for a specialist, like say podiatrist or orthodontist. Really that squeeze is affecting every single industry. So when we talk about affordability, it's important to think about the people that we rely on and really the people that are being squeezed out of our current economy. Again, so looking at, and this is just high level, where people fall in income brackets based on the area median income, that's the AMI, and what types of jobs those are. Because this is really a challenge that's not being felt by one industry or one demographic, it's across the board, and it won't improve without some significant changes. So this mismatch between housing costs and income leads to housing cost burdens. And there's currently burdens across the state, which is leading to wider income disparity. And it's pushing jobs where that were traditionally considered middle class, like say nursing, down the economic ladder because of affordability. And because we don't prioritize a continuum of housing types, we push workers further from job centers, adding to more carbon from vehicle trips and taking more of our available land for workers, as well as the workers' available time. So now, as we go a little bit further, we need to touch on just one point. We need apartments for students. We need entry-level workers. We need more townhomes for small families or retiring seniors. We also need more single-family homes for growing families. This is really a continuum that is not being matched currently for the needs of our region. And that said, there's still a fundamental supply and demand problem. We really just need a lot more. And without getting into what those numbers are, there's definitely some disagreements about how many we should be building, but we do all agree that there's literally every report agrees that we're really far behind. So really continuing across the board to meet the supply and demand imbalance to make a dent in this challenge. Because the lack of lower cost options for those earning median income or lower, they really have negative effects on the region's housing and labor markets, and we're seeing those effects, like I said, in every single industry. They're not able to both attract or retain their workforce, and it is definitely getting worse. So there's more middle income households that are staying renters, and this is decreasing the available housing stock that would go to lower income groups, as middle income households are able to outbid low income households for available units. So it's really a squeeze downwards, which is over extending our social safety nets because we have less supply than is currently available. So this is really a case for building a broad range of housing supply to address both the low income, median income households and to meet the needs of the majority of our residents. I'm going to actually skip through this slide. I can come back to it certainly if we need to, but basically we can spend a lot of time discussing creative ways to make things affordable, but the fact is the biggest threat to this is public will. We need a gradient of housing options that allows people to live affordably. We need families to start and grow and seniors to downsize, each when the timing is right, but that again requires a greater continuum of housing stock, and it definitely requires greater public will to make that happen. So I think I'll probably pause here. I have more slides to talk about actions, if we want to get into that a little bit later, but I probably want to hear from our other panelists, unless Jeff, you think I have more time.
You are good, Michael. Yeah, you can go a few more slides.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go into some, work that Reach is currently doing, and really we've at Reach we've really worked on our goal of increasing good paying jobs. So this is the jobs side of that, housing to jobs imbalance, working towards higher paying jobs in our region by 15,000 by 2030. So we really see that it's impossible to do this without a change in the trajectory of workforce housing costs. And again, when we say workforce, this is, the majority of the workers in our region. So we're really looking at, increasing our overall prosperity and connecting our infrastructure needs to our housing needs, and growing both the stock of housing supply and the infrastructure to support that. So that's roads, water, wastewater, and that would be sewer as well. So SLOCOG has contracted Reach to do some of the marketing and outreach, as well as the stakeholder engagement for this through something called the Regional Housing and Infrastructure Plan. And you'll probably all be hearing a little bit more about this later. But at a very high level, this plan is an inventory of our needs. It's a definition about what areas are most important to build housing. It's a prioritization of where that housing could be best built. And then it's a study of funding mechanisms to, again, make ourselves more resilient in the long run. And by ourselves, I mean our community. The Housing Infrastructure Plan has formed several committees, and it, again, is engaging multiple different stakeholders, some of them including Jeff and Krista on this call, but really looking at a wide range of community support for every phase of that project that I just showed. So what this is really looking to build is a solid framework for addressing that challenges. And I'm just going to pause without reading through all of these, because I really do believe, as I went back to school and started studying this, that the options are out there, that we definitely have roadmaps from other communities of ways to address this challenge. And again, public will is the biggest determinant, but I do believe that if San Luis Obispo County can't do it, no one can, because we do have passionate, smart people engaged in this process that live here. We're also just small enough to be able to actually talk to each other, have real conversations. And again, we have an area that is beautiful and inclusive, and we just need to make it more inclusive for all. So with that, I am going to just stop here and definitely pass it back to Jeff, and available for the Q&A at the end.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. Some great information, and appreciate it very much. We are now going to move on to Brenda Mack so she can share her experiences with this and really talk about some of the societal impacts and really why this issue is so very important to us at the end of the day. Brenda.
Oh, okay. So from my personal view, when I came up here in 2000, I was fleeing an abusive situation. Like a lot of women find themselves, but unfortunately, leaving their abuser, they become homeless, or you have to depend on the good graces. That the stress upon your children is something that people don't take into account. They may have witnessed the violence, and if not, they're still changing into a whole situation. And then you don't have the privacy of space to get together. And then there's the mental strain. There is trying to provide for your children, and you can't get housing. And if you do get housing, most of your income is going to go to housing. And then we're not going to talk about food and clothing and electricity and all those other little things. You're going to be constantly on this, I call it the hamster wheel, a hamster wheel of trying to make the rent so you can keep a roof over your kids' health. You might have to rob Peter to pay Paul. It is stressful. It is stressful on the individual. It is stressful for the children. It is stressful when you don't have enough free time to just enjoy life, or to take your kids somewhere where they can have fun, because you're too busy trying to make rent, keep a roof over your head. And then there's another thing. You sometimes have to put up with less than honorable landlords if the rent is low enough, so you'll put up with more things than you normally would, than you should have to. I also have seen recently, because I do housing canvassing where we go out and talk to tenants about their rights, there is a substantial increase in rent, and there are lawsuits, I believe, that are going on, but that's not going to help someone worrying about them being on the street and not knowing and in the elements. It just, it wears on you. It shouldn't be that way. It really should not be that way, where all your energy is going into keeping a roof over your head. And again, people talk about homelessness, and I'm gonna bring this up. Where are the homeless going to go when there are working poor? This is another thing. There are homeless people who have minimum wage jobs. They can't afford a house. They can't afford a roof over their head. People working cannot afford housing. Imagine that stress. That's all I've got to say on this subject.
Brenda, I'd like to ask you a question. Why do you think the average resident or citizen of the county or any particular city should actually care about this crisis? Why should they care that some of their fellow community members are unhoused?
First and foremost, I hear a lot of people complaining about service. You know, I'm in the grocery store, I'm at a fast food place, people are complaining about service because they don't have enough workers, because the workers cannot live here. They can't afford to live here. Everyone's complaining about the service. Well, I had to wait in line for that. Well, because it isn't that people do not want to work, they cannot live here. And here's something else. You sort of like people to smell good when they're waiting on you. Think about that. How are you going to shower? Okay. How are you going to shower when you're homeless? You see. So that's another, it shouldn't matter. If you want good service, you got to have people who can afford to live here. And that goes with your professionals too, like doctor wait times. We have a mental health crisis in this area because we don't have enough therapists. Okay. So there's a whole lot of stuff you don't think about. And let's talk about community. My kids basically grew up here. They can't afford to live here. I would like to have them part of the foundation of the city, but they got to go places. And I'm hearing that for other people saying, my kids can't live here. Wouldn't you like your kids to live here where they were raised? I think everybody would like that. And that's why the community should care, because as long as you step out your door, you're part of that community. Whether you like it or not, somehow somebody is going to affect what you do. I guess that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Brenda. Very well said. I appreciate that. We're going to move on to Krista's presentation. So Krista, would you please share what you have for us today?
I don't have a presentation today, Jeff, but I do want to just give kind of a preamble, like a eagle eye view of why housing matters, why I feel that it's the everything crisis. And just to kind of keep it in terms of current events, there's a lot of talk, Brenda talked about it a little bit, there's a lot of talk recently about the importance of mental health and the access to mental health care. The reason SLO County can't deliver mental health care is because we don't have the population that justifies the reimbursement rates for doctors. If you are 30 to 45 minutes away from the closest doctor because you can't afford to live where the doctors are, then that's going to hurt your ability to obtain the care that you need. There's also a lot of talk, especially during the crisis of COVID and just connection and community. There's a real serious crisis of belonging in this community, I believe. And I think when we look at who gets to stay here long term and who has to leave, not because they want to, not because there's better opportunity somewhere, but because they're leaving good opportunity here to settle for what they can survive with in other places. And I think when we talk about preserving neighborhoods, we don't talk enough about what it means to actually preserve neighbors, what it means to preserve community connections. And we can go deeper into that during the webinar. But along those same lines, there's a real concern about who actually gets to run our communities. There's been a lot of talk about it in terms of what our elected officials get paid. The SLO County Board of Supervisors just rejected raising the salaries. And I understand that that's contentious and that's a complicated issue, but the more it costs to live here, the more we have to try and retain the talent that's up and coming and not the people who bought their house 20, 30 years ago. The more it costs here, the more it's going to cost to keep people here. And all of that goes back to housing supply, housing availability, the protections that tenants have to stay in their home if that's something that they want to do. And just the way that we feel that our neighbors should be able to live in dignity and justice. And that's, we get bogged down in a lot of really nitty gritty details when it comes to what does the house look like and is it gonna look into my yard? But I think we have lost a lot of conversation around people. I've asked at several tabling events recently, what does it take to make a neighborhood? When you ask somebody what's a neighborhood, the first thing that people say, bar none for all of the other answers, is people, humans, people to share the space with. They don't talk about the architecture. They don't talk about, you know, the vibes, the community character. Well, it's characters that make up the community. It's if you have a neighborhood that's full of empty houses, that's not a neighborhood, that's a ghost town. And what I would really love to do, and what I think YIMBY does very well, is to keep that conversation around housing and housing affordability on people and preserving human life and human flourishing, and not just for the sake of, you know, the look of the building.
Thank you, Krista. I'm going to ask you to expound on something. I love what you said in terms of preserving neighborhoods. Preserving neighborhoods really means preserving neighbors. This is, at the end of the day, and Brenda hit on it as well, this is about people. This is about our brothers and sisters that are walking amongst us in our community. Krista, what do you see happening if this challenge is not addressed? If we kind of stay on the current trajectory that we're on, where Michael mentioned the gradients of housing, I call it the housing ladder, and we have a broken housing ladder. There are no rungs at the bottom of that housing ladder for someone to climb onto. So what do you see as the social implications, the societal implications, if we just maintain status quo and stay on this current trajectory?
I think you touched on it a little bit at the end. We're going to see a continuation of the current trajectory. I hear a lot of people talk about, well, we have to keep SLO County small, keep my city small, keep my neighborhood small. We have to prevent growth, like we have to keep it the same. And that's a fundamental false dichotomy. A community can decay or it can grow. It does not stay the same. That's not how human civilization has ever worked. It doesn't stay the same. It changes one way or another, for good or for bad. And I am very concerned that the longer this housing shortage goes on, the more we are going to have to see little old ladies that fall in their house and are alone for 5 or 6 days before somebody comes to check on them because her house is full of people's second homes or Airbnbs. I'm concerned that our schools are going to continue to suffer for having quality educators. We're going to continually rely on calling 911 or the fire service for every single thing that we need, rather than having neighbors that continuously check on us. And we're going to see the physical structure of our area decay. Arroyo Grande, I live in Grover Beach, in case anybody missed that, and our neighboring city of AG is really struggling with the cost of their infrastructure. Their city is very spread out and it's very sprawling. There's hardly any high density housing, and there's simply not enough tax revenue to justify the cost of maintaining those streets. And Grover has passed a bond in order to cover the cost of those roads. But even so, like, the cost of infrastructure gets justified based on how many people and how much activity is happening along that street. And if you don't build along it, then your street's just going to continue to crumble. And that's not something that I want for the Central Coast. I think we are looking at a precipice of the Central Coast right now, and we are either going to step in to what the future could have for us, and we're going to say, what we're doing right now is not working, and we're going to be a little bit nervous about it, but we're going to step forward into the future instead of digging in our heels. And on the other side, we can just choose to die, to decay. And it can be a retirement community for the healthy and wealthy and nobody else. And I don't think anyone wants that.
Very good. Thank you, Krista. All right, folks, we are going to move into the Q&A portion of our presentation. I want to thank our panelists for your introductory remarks and your presentation. And to all those that are viewing this presentation, we have a Q&A box down at the bottom. Please use the Q&A box as opposed to the chat to submit your questions, and we will address as many of them as we can. I'm going to start off with Michael. I guess I'll start with the housekeeping ones with you, Michael. Someone asked what REACH is, and then also asked how workforce housing is defined. So if you could please address those two first. And then I do have a follow-up question for you, Michael.
Yeah, so REACH is a local economic development, economic action organization on the Central Coast. And again, we working towards more high-paying jobs on the Central Coast, as well as housing and infrastructure needs. So hopefully that answers that. I did see on the Q&A a response to our website, but I'm happy to include that as well. It's definitely a great website, recently updated. As far as the workforce housing question, I do try to use working households above, and rather than saying workforce housing, because workforce housing is a HUD term, actually, which is defined as 80 to 160% of the area's median income in our county. So, that's a specific term for, where people fit within a range of income. So when we're talking about working households, though, we're really talking about, people who are in our community and the jobs we've talked about, whether they're nurses or grocery store clerks or bank tellers or therapists. How they fit in the affordability bracket, and realistically, more than 60% of them are stretched, both rental and home ownership, and in our county of San Luis Obispo. And if you look at that broken down by city, it's pushing further and further to the edge. So when we talk about long-term, repercussions of that, it really is, increase in sprawl, and how far out we can go is going to eventually either eat up more of our beautiful green belt or eat up farmland. And I think that's a constant tension that we have to, be aware of. But if ways to address that would be to, build infill and look at the best use of available land that matches the jobs that we have, so that people aren't spending their time commuting, so that we aren't overcrowding our roads because we've aligned the jobs or the housing where the jobs are. I think that answers the question, hopefully.
Yeah, good. Michael, could you dive just a little bit more deeply into AMI's area median income and those different divisions that we talk about all the time, low income, very low income, but just give an overview of exactly how that works and why that's important.
Yeah, I'm laughing because you probably would be much better suited to give that explanation. But yeah, again, going back to like how we plan for housing growth and how HUD has, identified buckets of income categories that should be built for each of those buckets. So if we're looking at the area median income in our county, I should have that up, but I don't. It's really a percentage of that. So when we say moderate working families, that's 80 to 120%. Again, workforce housing would be 80 or 160% of that area median income. And then it goes lower income, which is 50 to 80%, very low, 30 to 50, and then extremely low would be less than 30% of the area's median income. So I think it's more important though to kind of talk about who or what occupations fall within those brackets. So when we talk about like nurses, pharmacists, dental hygienists, those in our region are at the 50 to 80% of area median income. So, that's considered low income families, which I would say in most generations, that's been a decent paying job. That's been a solidly middle class, and now we got class thrown in there. But we've seen in the trajectory of how we built housing in California a slipping down. So now what is traditionally a middle class job has fallen into what is considered low income, and I think that has again stretched people beyond their means in some ways, and it's definitely kept more people at the younger generation renting longer. So, the challenge there is, again, looking at the jobs that we, consider good paying and matching that with where they can afford within these income brackets.
Very good.
And Jeff, feel free to add to that. Like I said, this is your wheelhouse more than mine.
Yes, thank you. Yes, with the work that I do at the Housing Trust Fund, we pay very close attention to AMIs, we call it for shorter area median income. And that defines largely where some funding can come to and how can come from and how readily we can access that funding. So it is an important number that we use when we talk about affordable housing. Typically, that's defined as 30% of an individual's income, gross income. And if it's 30% or below, it's affordable. If it's above that, then it's considered unaffordable. And when we look at most folks that are renting, they're paying 50% of their income or above. And we know that that things are unaffordable when we look at the actual statistical numbers. We have hopefully we can post a link to the county's website that has the actual numbers for the area median income. But I know that's something that's kicked around a lot, and I just wanted to give some really specific definition to that for our viewers. A question came through that I thought is very good here. So I'm going to ask this one to the panelists, and I'll put it out to whoever wants to answer it. How do we balance the need for affordable housing and environmental protection with an eye toward preventing loss of habitat and the urgency of preventing climate change? Is there a path forward of not an either or choice? So
I can speak to that, Jeff.
Absolutely. Go for it, Krista.
So the best thing that you can do to fight climate change is to give up your car. There's a lot of talk around going vegan or vegetarian, and that helps, or switching a gas car for an EV or a hybrid, but really getting rid of the car, period, is the best thing that you can do. And the only feasible way to ask people to do that is to let them live in high resource neighborhoods where they can walk to any number of things that they need in a given week. And we have largely decided that those places that are very expensive, where you can walk to a lot of stuff, downtown slow, places where people like to live and like to spend time, we've basically banned building like that for the last 40 or 50 years. As the ability to discriminate against people of color was eroded by state and federal law, we started mandating larger lots, larger homes, big yards, and you basically put more and more space between buildings, whether it's commercial, residential, or both. We have cities that are separated by land use, so commercial, retail, residential, industrial, and nobody here is going to advocate for like industrial uses to be in residential neighborhoods, but that's just an example. So the best thing that we can do to both protect the environment and enact the climate action that so many of us want to see is to build denser housing and varied housing in places where people already want to live and work. And the way that we know where those places are is they're very expensive right now. It used to be very common to take a single family house and convert it into a duplex, but until very recently that was illegal. It was very common to be able to build a building that has a storefront right on the street, and you can build an apartment or 2 apartments up above it. That's been illegal for a long time as well. And now banks don't even lend on it. There's not even a loan product for it a lot of times anyway. So we have to kind of look forward in terms of construction methods and innovate in that space. But we also need to take a few minutes to look back at the way we used to build our communities back when there was a whole lot less money to do it, frankly, and look at the way we used to build places and help that carry us into the future.
Very good. Thank you, Krista.
Jeff, I might just add one point to that too, if that's okay.
Of course.
I think it's important to recognize that, there's often a sentiment that, let's not build it here. It's not right for here, build it somewhere else or let it go somewhere else. That somewhere else is almost always further and further from jobs. So, when we say somewhere else over and over again, we're really saying people need to drive further in a vehicle to get to their jobs or to get to the things that they need. And that we're already stretching that in our county. We're already seeing that, people commute to the city of SLO from Paso Robles. People commute to Vandenberg Air Force Base from, Grover Beach. That's further and further trips from high job centers because we aren't focusing on building where we should. So I think it's important to say, if it's not here, where else that's closer? And, that if from an environmental standpoint, again, fewer vehicle miles traveled is the best way that we can address some of that.
Thank you, Michael, for that addition. And so that does address the environmental consequences. I want to focus a little bit on the personal consequences, the human consequences. Someone mentioned in our questions as well that when people don't live where they work, they spend a lot of their time and energy commuting. And as someone who's volunteered a fair amount of my time as well, I know that I've come across people that want to volunteer more, but and I'm going to go to Brenda on this in a moment, when those folks are having to basically do almost everything they can just to provide shelter over their families' heads, that person's most likely not going to show up at the PTA meeting or the town hall meeting, or even self-help practices that they may go to, things like yoga or any other type of program like that. So let's talk a little bit about the implications, and after Brenda, I'm going to come back to you, Michael, just in terms of employers and how this affects employers. But when we don't have enough housing, Brenda, how do you see that as consequence to families? And if you have any stories or experiences of other folks that have gone into being unhoused and back to being housed, just what the implications of that have been and the challenges too.
As someone who went from homeless to housing, it's a sense of relief once you have housing that you can afford. It isn't really a relief if you get housing and you're still scared you're going to lose it. And that sort of stays with you also. And you have to think about children and their test scores, okay? Their future, you don't have that time. You're hustling always to do the rent, or you're stressed out because, there's rent increases usually every year or whatever. Quality time with your family. And right now, what people forget, it takes 2 incomes almost to have an affordable house. So it's not like in the old days where mom could be at home and get to go, like I said, the PTA and do the little bake sales and all this other stuff. You have to stretch your time because both parents are working, and which brings up childcare costs. They are astronomical. That is something that people are not thinking about. I mean, it is astronomical. So there's a big expense. So you are working to afford this house, and then you got this huge trunk for quality care for your kids. That's another stressor, that hasn't been brought up. I will speak on the transportation issue also, because I am a bus rider, and I know that we've had problems with the transportation in our county, and what I saw when they limited their hours, the impact on people working, because a lot of our employees would like to take the bus, but when you limit because you don't have the money, you limit service, then that also will affect the type of job you have. Like in our county on the weekends, the buses are basically not running. So how can you work on the weekend? You know, you understand, unless you have a car, or you have to depend on a ride, and okay, and if your car breaks down, what are you going to do? I know I'm a little bit all over the map, but these are expenses that people don't think about when you're trying to live here.
Brenda, thank you. And one follow-up question. What, in your opinion, what do you think is the biggest barrier for unhoused folks to get back into that pathway of being housed again?
It's mental health, believe it or not, and we're starting to talk about it now, is that you've been out in, I'd say, the wilds, or you have not had a place of your own. You have not had security. And then suddenly you're told you're now secure. There is a mental thing that goes with that people are just now talking about, that prevents people, because there's not enough mental health services to help people who have experienced homelessness adapt and adjust to living in a household. Think about it. You've been living in a creek for a while, or if you're a woman being out there homeless, if you're by yourself or whatever, there's all kind of stuff that happens out there. And then they put you in an enclosed place. What are you gonna do? Because before I became homeless, I looked at a lot of people said, oh, they gave them a house and they're back on the street like a month later. What's wrong with them? I know what's wrong with them now. There's a whole psychological, physiological thing that goes on. And if we don't have the services, and let me make this clear. Housing first is important. You're trying to ask someone to stop drinking, do drugs before they get into a house. So yeah, let me be sober and watch me live in this creek. How much sense does that make? So housing first, with support, with therapists and other professionals who can afford to live in this community, affects us all. I'm a little passionate. I'm sorry.
We love it, Brenda. That's why you're here. Thank you. Michael, because we're talking today about why people should care about affordable housing, I'm going to ask one more question that looks at the problem, and then we've got several questions in our feed that are more solution oriented. So we'll transition after this question to looking at solutions and maybe some of the barriers to solutions, but still looking at why this is important. Can you give us, Michael, the perspective from an economic standpoint, employers? In other words, what negative effects does a lack of affordable housing have on our local economy and the vibrancy of our economy?
Yeah, I think Brenda hit on a key piece of it just now, of just the capacity for individuals that are either struggling with homelessness or struggling with just affordability. Like if your basic human need of shelter isn't taken care of or is constantly at threat, your capacity is limited. So from a very basic level, employers, I would assume, would all want people with high capacity, right? And the capacity of the workforce is going to be diminished when, again, there's a basic human need there. And I can say, as a very real example, I employed 18 people when I was a branch manager, and some of them came and go throughout the years. I did it for 10 years, and very rarely did I have more than 2 of them that lived in San Luis Obispo City. The branch was in San Luis Obispo, but everybody commuted from somewhere else. And that was important because when things like the grade shut down because of traffic, it impacted my work. It impacted who could show up for work. When there were the forest fires, and people weren't able to come in. These are major events, but it is so much harder as an employer when your people are further and further away. So just one real component here. But I'll also say, on a much bigger scale, when we say affordability is an issue, we're talking about things like we've just said, at a very low income, but also at a high income. Cal Poly has a challenge attracting good professors when they look at the cost of living in our area. Major hospitals here have a challenge attracting good surgeons when they say, the quality of life here versus what I get somewhere else. And that's a real issue, right? That even $300,000 a year jobs still have a challenge when they look at what they get. So it really is across the board. And I come back to how much capacity we have for our workers, and again, how good we are at attracting the best possible workers, because I think we all want to live in a community that is vibrant and has the best of the best. In a lot of ways we do, but we are going to start losing that if we don't do something.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. So as I mentioned, let's look forward now at potential solutions. It's obvious that we have negative consequences with the unaffordability of our housing. And the simple solution, of course, is to add more housing. So maybe we'll crack this nut today. I don't know. But Krista, I'm going to start with you on this one. Why, in your opinion, why is it that we're not adding more housing, particularly at the lower rungs of that housing ladder, which would be multifamily, meaning apartments, smaller footprint homes, and subsidized housing as well? But it seems that the entry level is where the real challenge is. But why, in your opinion, are we not adding more sufficient housing?
Lack of political will at the leadership level, Jeff, is the shortest answer that I can put. And the answers to these kinds of questions about why we're not building more can get a little wonky. So it's a technical question that you're asking, and so the answers are going to be technical when you get into the nitty gritty. But at the big level, the people who are elected to serve the cities and counties in California have not prioritized what the actual considerable popular will is, which is that people do actually support housing. When you take big scale surveys and do really in-depth research on whether people support more housing in general, the answer is almost always overwhelmingly yes. And when it comes to your local planning commission or your local city council, that's a very targeted demographic of people who already live here, who can make it to a 6 p.m. meeting in the middle of the week, who don't have kids to feed, who don't have to run to their job waiting tables. And that's all they hear from. So even though the population as a whole supports more housing and doesn't want homelessness to continue and wants, prices to come down, the only people they hear from are people who are considerably wealthier, wider, and invested in the status quo. And if you want to go deeper into some of the technical stuff as to why we're not building different ranges of housing, I can do that, but that's the shortest answer. So if you're in this webinar and you're thinking, well, this problem is obvious and we need to fix it, so why aren't we fixing it? It's because you're not going to city council or planning commission and telling those people that they need to fix it.
Interesting. And
not you personally, Jeff.
I know. Well, I noticed from I looked at the participant list earlier, and we have a handful of elected representatives in our audience today too. So it's an interesting challenge and dilemma in that regard. In that, as you mentioned, Krista, we talked to just about anyone. Well, most folks in the community will agree that housing affordability has hit crisis stage. We certainly don't feel it's proper to have our neighbors, some of them unhoused and on the streets. But what I heard you say is where the rubber meets the road on a lot of that is political will. So I appreciate that very much. Michael, I have the same question to you, and I'll go to Brenda after you as well. Why do you think, Michael, we're not getting the housing built, particularly at the lower rungs of the ladder, that we need?
I think at a very basic level, we've continued to do the same thing. And, I do hear people say housing crisis pretty frequently. I say it frequently, but I don't think we treat it like a crisis because it's continued. And if it was truly a crisis, we would be addressing it with urgency. And we wouldn't be, honestly, we wouldn't be as concerned about, how it looks or exactly where it should be. And so in that context, I don't think we've gotten to the point where we're feeling the crisis. And I will say probably everybody on this call, or on this panel is feeling that and trying to impart that urgency. And so, there are ways that we can do this differently. It will involve, like Krista mentioned, and like I said, political will. It will involve us, people who care showing up to the meetings. It will involve you talking to your neighbors about being good neighbors and saying, yes, we need more. Because realistically, it really doesn't take much to oppose, and it doesn't take much to stall and make projects very, very expensive. But it takes a lot to kind of unravel the policy and the challenges that we've built up over the time. So I am probably not in the position to advocate for one specific, but I would say, it is time for sure to start looking at different options and looking at different ways of doing things, because our current trajectory has not brought us to a great spot.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. Brenda, why do you think things aren't happening the way they should? And also any advice that you have for us, because I've been in different meetings with you, Brenda, and heard your voice and appreciate your voice. Is there anything that you can add in terms of advice for all of us listening that would help us amplify our voice? Because I see you amplifying the voice of unhoused individuals in our county. We're talking about political will and the fact that we need to continue to move the direction of political will toward providing more housing. So I'll rephrase that as simple as I can. That was a little wordy, Brenda. Why do you think it is that we're not building enough housing, and what can we do to amplify our voices?
I'm agreeing with both panelists. It is education. We need to educate ourselves. There's talk of tiny houses. That's something new. But if you say tiny house to the average person, they think, I don't know, like this little thing. But I actually did a tour of the tiny house that Sheriff's Space, okay, I'm mangling their name, and seeing how those can work. There are things people are doing with commercial buildings, which we can convert into housing. I'm hesitant of when I hear high density. I think projects, back in the, I don't know, good time days of people stacked on top of people and just very sterile. As we educate ourselves and educate our lawmakers on what density can actually look like, can be nice, can be a place where everyone's safe and comfortable and flow with the environment, because I like trees like the next person. I think it is an education. I think that I'm constantly learning along with everybody else. What does this look like? Okay, can we convert this? Okay, what about green space? Also the fear when people hear low income housing, they think crime. And that is not always the case, but things can be made safer. And people need to understand, if you have children, what do you want your children to have? When my father came up here in 82, his house payment was $114 for his house. Okay, yeah, you're not going to get anything like that, even a room nowadays. What are our children going to have? And if you don't have any children, don't you want the people that are going to be taking care of you when you need assistance? Do you want them to have affordable housing? I think we need to stress this. I think we need to personalize this so that our lawmakers need to understand that they might need to do town halls at unusual times, so we can get a feel for the community, like Krista says. You might have to do one like at 7 or 8 in the morning. That's out the box, but you've got people before they get to work that can chime in on what's going on. Maybe you got to do it a little bit late. I've been at city council meetings where they've gone to midnight. You have got to listen to the people that you serve, or you won't be serving them too much longer, is what I say. That's my input.
Thank you, Brenda. There have been several questions in the feed, panelists, about our existing housing stock and the fact that we may not be using it as good as it could be used to provide for shelter. Some of the issues that came up were student housing, that some of our, a substantial portion of our housing stock in the county is designated towards student housing, or at least occupied by students. Also vacation rentals, that there is a significant portion of our housing stock that is serving out-of-town vacationers as opposed to folks that work and live here. And then lastly, vacant second homes, homes that sit empty a majority of the year. These are all challenging because at the same time, we would want to direct direct that those homes be used for local folks. There are, of course, property rights, and the owner of a property can do almost whatever they want with that property within the law. So this is a tough one, I think. Krista, how do you feel about how we're using our existing housing stock? And are there policies or political will or changes that should be made in terms of how we are using our existing stock?
I know you're not supposed to touch the third rail in this discussion, but I'm going to touch it because that's what I do. There is a really strong disincentive to using the land that we have already developed to its highest and best use. And a lot of people are actually really surprised to learn that Prop 13 doesn't only benefit the house that you live in, it benefits any property that you own, residential, commercial, whether you live in it the whole year or only part of the year. And I think in terms of long-term, fully structural corrections to our housing supply, we have to address how Prop 13 works, how we protect low-income seniors so that they don't get taxed out of their house, but we also give them options so that when you've got little old grandmas who email me every week saying that they're trapped in a 5-bedroom house out in Corbett Canyon and they can't rely on kids who have moved out of the state. Like, we need to give those people options. And then for the other side of things, for people who are just hoarding housing, there needs to be a tax penalties for that. I don't think Prop 13 should be extended to a house that you don't live in the majority of the year. And that's a significant disincentive to redeveloping property and allowing it to be opened up for other people. I saw another couple of questions in the chat that all kind of center around, like, how can we keep these certain people from coming here, whether it's students or people from out of the area or people who are vacationing here. And I'm going to tell everybody on this webinar that that is the wrong question. We can't do it. You cannot check passports at the county line, and you need to get over that. This is a tough problem that is going to require more serious solutions than how do we keep other people from coming here? Because if you scroll through your Nextdoor feed and it looks anything like mine, you're going to see, I just moved here from San Jose. So glad to be here. How do I meet people? Or, you know, I just moved here to help take care of my mom and I need this, that, or the other, like medical services. Like, you just look through your basic landscape and you see people are still coming here, even though our building levels have gone like this over decades. You can't keep people from coming here. You need to build significant supply across the continuum of housing for everybody. Period. End of story.
Thank you, Krista. Michael?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that literally everywhere in California has this problem too. It's not that we are super unique and, you know, are challenged by this. And it is spreading to the rest of the US as well. As in North Carolina last summer in Raleigh, and literally their next door looks the same, where they're complaining about Airbnbs and they're complaining, you know, about tech workers taking up all their housing stock. And that only really happens when there is a supply and demand imbalance, right? If we had sufficient supply for the workers and then there were extra houses taken up by Airbnb, that would be an Airbnb problem. That would be an investment problem. But currently we have a worker problem, that the people who, you know, are part of our local economy are challenged by the ability to afford to live here. So, you know, I do also want to flip that on the head. I definitely wouldn't touch the third rail, but, you know, I do think it's important to say, like, it really comes down to there's not sufficient supply, and we have data to show we haven't built enough for a very long time. And so it's compounding on top of itself.
Is it overly simplistic to say that really the solution does lie in adding additional supply? Again, particularly at the lower rungs of that ladder? Is that a naive, simplistic position, Michael?
I would say it's absolutely necessary. So, whether that's the only fix is probably the better question, because we probably also need some additional social safety nets. We probably also need to, work on focusing on how we get more head of household or high paying jobs in our region as well. It's not just one thing, just this thing is definitely a challenge. The supply is currently the biggest challenge. So, I think also to that point, we could look at other areas, we could compare ourselves to somewhere else and say, what have other people done? And usually, that involves changing some local policy, some level of either speeding up the development process to make it more efficient and effective for developers, or changing restrictions that developers face, that make things less affordable. But it all comes down to how we build and what we build.
Yeah, very, very good. Thank you. And as you answered that, Michael, I was thinking of some of the things that Brenda brought up about mental health, and Krista brought up about neighborhoods and evolving those neighborhoods. And you're right. It's a little bit of a lot of different things that we're going to need to touch on to get us out of this challenge. We are going to conclude, folks, with some closing remarks from each of our panelists. Again, I want to thank our three panelists for the information. I know that I've watched our participant number and it stayed constant up until the end here, which is very rare for a panel of this type. So I congratulate our three panelists on doing such a good job and holding the attention of our audience until the very end here. So we'll just take a minute or so for each of you to make a closing remark. And we will go in the same order that we started off with, Michael, and then Brenda, and then Krista. So Michael, if you would please give us a few concluding remarks.
I feel like I've summarized pretty accurately, where the position is, but I would just say, as far as the issue goes, it really does encompass a lot of other things, and I very much want to see a community where my kid can afford to live here someday. I definitely want to see a community where workers have more capacity. I definitely want to see a community, that is strong and resilient and vibrant. And to do that, this is a key component. So, if you walk away with nothing else other than just housing's a key component, that's my message.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. Brenda, some closing comments from you, please.
Sorry about that. I would just say, why does it matter to people? Why should they, about affordability? Think about it. You may be only a paycheck or an illness away from being homeless. The other thing is, I like this county. I think this county has great things, but if everybody's leaving the county, what is the county going to look like? And yes, people come into the county and bring good things into the county, but I think that you need to care about when you're going to the grocery store and you're complaining that you're in a line of 10 people. You need to care about when you see a homeless person on the street, knowing basically there's no house for them. You need to care about when you might need a specialist for yourself or your child and there's not one in the area. You need to care about the environment because you got someone commuting 2 hours away and you have a bus system that does not adequately cover the county. You need to care because you need to care. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Appreciate it. And Krista, final thoughts from you, please.
I'm so glad that we had so many wonderful community leaders on this panel, and I hope that I have poked the bear in enough places that I'm lighting a fire under some people. If you're a voter on this webinar and you're just kind of doe in the headlights, I don't want you to get discouraged. This stuff can get technical and overwhelming, but it is not impossible. This is a problem that can be solved. there are concrete solutions to solve it. I would be happy to talk about those with you at any point in time. I'm not hard to get a hold of. And if you're an elected official on this webinar and you're looking at the landscape of things that you have to do and things that you might have to say to voters, I would encourage you to think really long and hard about what it is you're asking voters to do. You're not asking them to throw their town away. You're asking them to fix it. You're asking them to save it. And I would really love to see our elected officials have honest conversations about what kind of change it's going to take in order for us to save ourselves. There's nobody coming except us. This is a problem that is not going to go away. The next election cycle, it's still going to be here unless you fix it. What are you going to look back on as your legacy of what you did when the call of the community came for you? What are you going to say? Are you going to say that you buried your head in the sand and you played it safe, or that you were willing to risk it to do something for everybody else? And I hope that that keeps you awake at night in all the right ways.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Again, thank you to our three panelists. Going into this, I certainly cared about affordable housing. And after listening to each of you, Brenda, Michael, and Krista, I care more. So thank you for sharing your passion about this topic. And lastly, thank you to our audience for your attendance and your very insightful questions this afternoon. We hope that you found this presentation of value the way I did. With that, I will conclude. I'm going to turn it over to Glenn Silloway, who I believe may have a housekeeping item here at the very end. But again, thank you for your attendance. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Jeff and panel. You were all wonderful. I appreciate your time, your thoughtfulness, and your encouragement for people to get involved and do more about affordable housing. Thank you on behalf of the League. And don't forget, on June 5th at noon on a Monday, we'll have the next installment on this series. We invite you all to attend. We'll be sending out the link or the invitation to the link in the next couple of days. So thank you, and I'm going to say goodbye. We'll see you next time.